Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at something that I think we all kind of secretly want to be good at, right? Speaking English confidently.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Whether you're getting ready for like a big presentation or you just want to, brush up on things, or if you're just fascinated by language like me. I have a feeling that the sources you sent me have something for everyone.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, being able to speak confidently in any language, it's such a superpower. And what I think is so cool about the sources we have for this deep dive is they kind of go beyond just like the surface level tips and they really dig into the psychology behind why we get nervous. And you know how we can actually like reframe those feelings and build up our confidence. It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Stuff that I think everyone can benefit from for sure.
Yeah, I love that. It's like they're not just telling us what to do, but they're like giving us the tools to actually change our mindset about it.
Totally.
One of the things that really stood out to me from the sources was this whole idea of like embracing mistakes. You know,
Oh, yeah.
they really emphasize that mistakes are your best teacher.
Yeah.
I can totally relate to that. I remember when I was first learning Spanish, I like totally butchered a basic greeting in front of like a whole group of people.
No.
It was so embarrassing at the time, but I gotta say, it was the quickest way to learn the right pronunciation.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like our brains are kind of hardwired to like learn best from those moments, right?
Yeah.
What's so interesting is these sources actually connect that idea to the whole concept of neuroplasticity.
Okay.
So like how our brains can change and adapt.
Yeah.
When we make a mistake, it actually like creates a stronger neural pathway, especially when we correct it and move forward.
Oh.
So instead of seeing mistakes as failures, these sources really encourage us to view them as these feedback loops that help us like really refine our skills over time.
I like that a lot. So it's like each mistake is actually like a little victory in disguise.
Totally, yeah.
That's a much better way to look at it. And speaking of like shifting our perspective, one source had this really cool approach, I thought. They basically suggested like sometimes you should just ditch the textbook and just immerse yourself in English. I'm picturing all our listeners like trading those grammar drills for an afternoon of movies with subtitles on.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually a really great strategy, and there's actually like a scientific reason for it.
Okay.
A lot of these sources point out that our brains are actually wired for language acquisition through exposure. They call it implicit learning.
Okay.
So think about it, like how kids learn their first language. They don't start with textbooks, right? They're just surrounded by like sounds and rhythms from day one. So, whether it's podcasts, music, movies, or even just like overhearing conversations,
Yeah.
surrounding yourself with English can really speed up how fast you learn.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like soaking it all up through osmosis. But we can't just passively absorb everything, right? At some point, we got to actively practice.
Yeah.
And I love this one suggestion. One of the sources suggested that you should talk to yourself in the mirror.
Oh, yeah.
Has anybody out there actually tried that?
Hi.
It sounds a little silly, but I've done it.
Oh, yeah, me too.
It can actually be really effective.
Oh, it totally works. I mean, it might feel a little awkward at first,
Yeah.
but, there's a method to madness.
Right.
What the sources are getting at here is this idea of deliberate practice, which is all about focused, intentional repetition.
Okay.
So it's not just mindless repetition. It's like really pushing yourself beyond your comfort zone, identifying those areas where you want to improve, and then just like consciously working on them. So talking to yourself in the mirror, while, yeah, it might feel strange, it lets you practice your pronunciation, your intonation, your body language,
Yeah.
All in a safe, judgment-free zone.
Like a personal rehearsal space for your English skills.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
That's great. And speaking of practicing specific elements, one of the sources goes into detail about pronunciation, and they even give this classic tongue twister, she sells seashells by the seashore, the one that always trips us up.
Oh, I can never do that one.
But they make this really good point about how even small pronunciation errors can affect how clearly people understand us.
Oh, totally. It's so true. And it's not just about being understood, Pronunciation, especially intonation, like how your voice rises and falls, that can actually convey confidence too.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of sources suggest that mimicking native speakers is a really good way to develop a more natural flow and rhythm to your speech.
Okay.
And this brings up a good question for you, listener. Which English dialect, resonates with you the most? Because picking good models for intonation can make a real difference in how you sound and how confident you feel.
So it's like finding your own voice within the language.
Exactly, yeah.
But even with all the practice and like the right mindset, sometimes that fear of making mistakes still creeps in.
Yeah, for sure. It's hard to shake sometimes.
Yeah. One source had this quote that I found so reassuring. They said, "Every expert was once a beginner."
Oh, I love that.
It reminds us that everybody starts somewhere, and even the most fluent English speakers had to like stumble and fumble their way through it at the beginning.
Totally. And it's such a good point about self-efficacy, like that belief in your own ability to actually succeed. The sources are really emphasizing that confidence isn't something you're just born with. It's something you develop through practice and perseverance and
Hmm.
positive self-talk. So instead of focusing on being afraid of making mistakes, focus on like the excitement of learning and the progress you're making.
Yes, I love that. It's all about shifting that focus from fear to possibility.
Exactly.
But, before we get too deep into all that, I think we should probably take a short break to just let everything sink in for a minute.
Yeah, good idea. So, picking up where we left off, I think it's important to acknowledge that speaking a new language, it can be super daunting.
Oh, yeah.
And the sources we're looking at, they really highlight that feeling of vulnerability, especially when you're first starting out.
For sure. It can feel like a huge leap to go from practicing by yourself to actually having conversations out in the real world.
Totally.
One source actually had some really great advice about how to bridge that gap. They said to start small with what they call low stakes
Oh,
interactions,
yeah, I love that.
like ordering food, asking for directions, even just like chatting with the cashier.
Mhm.
Those little moments can actually build up your confidence.
That's so true. And what's so cool about those low stakes interactions is that they kind of create this like positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
Every time you successfully navigate one of those situations, it just reinforces your belief that you can actually do this,
Yeah.
that you can speak English in real life settings. And the sources actually connect this to the concept of desensitization. So the more we expose ourselves to something that makes us anxious, the less power it has over us.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's like dipping your toes in the water before you jump in the deep end.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, that's a good way to put it. And speaking of like learning from real world experiences, one source really emphasizes the importance of listening.
Oh, yeah, such a good point.
It's so easy to get caught up in worrying about what we're going to say next that we forget to actually pay attention to what the other person is saying.
Right, and active listening is like such an underrated skill in language learning.
Mm,
Not only does it help you understand the conversation better, but it also exposes you to different accents and vocabulary and those subtle nuances of intonation that we were talking about earlier.
mhm.
Remember, language is a two-way street. It's about connection as much as it is about expressing yourself.
It's like a dance, right? Finding that flow between speaking and listening.
I like that, yeah.
Now, one thing that often trips people up, myself included, is pronunciation. One source actually had a whole section on different techniques for improving your pronunciation, from tongue twisters and shadowing native speakers to using pronunciation apps. I've tried a few of those apps myself, and I gotta say, they can be really helpful for those sounds that you just can't seem to get quite right.
Yeah, technology can be a really cool tool, but a lot of these sources also caution against relying on it too much. The real key is to practice pronouncing words in context, like within phrases and sentences. Remember, it's all about that music of language and how intonation can completely change what you're saying.
So it's like learning to play an instrument. You're not just hitting individual notes, you're creating a melody.
Exactly. You got it.
Now, let's talk about grammar for a second. It can feel like a minefield sometimes.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And I know a lot of learners get so hung up on getting everything perfectly grammatically correct. Did the sources have any advice on that? Like how to find that balance between accuracy and fluency?
It's interesting. They actually encourage learners to prioritize fluency over accuracy,
Hmm.
at least when you're just starting out.
Really?
Yeah. It's that whole idea of progress, not perfection that we talked about before. The goal is to just get comfortable expressing yourself, even if you make a few mistakes along the way.
Okay. See, that's a relief to hear. I think we all can be a little too hard on ourselves sometimes when it comes to grammar. But there's got to be a balance, right? Like we can't just ignore the rules completely.
Right. The sources suggest that, yeah, you should build a solid foundation in grammar, but don't let it hold you back from actually speaking. As you get more comfortable and more fluent, you can kind of gradually refine your grammar skills over time. Think of it like learning to ride a bike.
Mhm.
You wouldn't start by focusing on like perfect balance and technique. You would just start by getting comfortable with the basic movements and then gradually improve as you go.
Perfect analogy. It's
Yeah,
about finding that sweet spot between like structure and freedom.
exactly.
Yeah. But, let's be real for a second. Sometimes our brains just feel like they're going to explode when we're trying to speak another language.
Oh, yeah.
One of the sources actually mentioned that feeling of being overwhelmed, like there's just too much information to process. Did they offer any strategies for dealing with that?
They did. They said that the key is to just break things down into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay.
So instead of trying to master everything at once, just focus on one specific aspect of language at a time. Maybe this week you work on pronunciation, next week you focus on building your vocabulary. It's all about setting realistic goals and pacing yourself. You're in control of your learning journey.
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in comparing ourselves to others, but, everybody learns at their own pace. One thing I find that really helps with that is just celebrating those little victories along the way.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Whether it's nailing a tricky pronunciation or having a conversation where you just felt a little bit more confident, those moments deserve to be celebrated.
Absolutely. The sources talk about the importance of positive reinforcement, not just from other people,
Yeah.
but from yourself too. Did you use a new phrase correctly? Did you understand a joke in English? Those are all wins. Remember, confidence is built on all those little positive experiences.
It's like those video games where you level up with each quest you complete. Every conversation is a chance to gain XP.
I love that.
And one thing that can really help boost those experience points is being mindful of our body language.
That's so true. The sources really emphasize that, nonverbal communication plays a huge role in how confident we seem and how we feel.
Yeah.
They talk about the importance of good posture, making eye contact, even using gestures to emphasize what you're saying. Like put on a suit of armor.
Sure.
When you carry yourself with confidence, it changes how other people see you, but it also changes how you see yourself.
It's about projecting that inner confidence outward. And, as we're talking about all these different elements of speaking confidently, one thought keeps coming back to me. It's a journey, not a destination. It's all about constantly learning and growing and refining your skills.
You said it perfectly.
Hmm.
And that journey is different for everyone. What works for one person might not work for another. So as you continue on your path to speaking English confidently, I encourage you to be curious, experiment, find what works best for you.
Yeah, and remember, you don't have to do this alone. There are so many resources out there. Language exchange partners, online communities, apps, AI tools, the list goes on and on.
It really does. And let's not forget the most valuable resource of all, your own intuition and self-awareness. Trust your ability to learn, celebrate every step of progress, and never stop exploring this amazing world of language.
On that note of inspiration, I guess we've reached the end of our deep dive for today. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question. So if the fear of making mistakes is what's holding you back, what is one small, safe mistake you could intentionally make in English today? Just to prove to yourself it's not really that big of a deal.
Yeah, just think of it as like a little experiment in confidence building.
Right.
Who knows, you might even end up with a funny story to tell.
Exactly.
But before you go off and plan your mistake, I want to circle back to something we mentioned earlier, mindset.
Mhm.
The sources really emphasize that how we view our own abilities can either help or hinder us as we're learning.
It's so true. One source put it this way: confidence isn't about being perfect. It's about believing in yourself and your ability to learn. And I think so many language learners, they kind of fall into that perfectionist trap where they feel like they need to know everything before they can even open their mouths.
Yeah, it's almost like they're waiting for this moment when they'll suddenly feel ready to speak.
Right.
But what these sources suggest is a totally different approach. It's more about embracing the whole journey, imperfections and all. They talk about the importance of developing a growth mindset. So that idea that your abilities aren't fixed, but that they can be developed through effort and practice.
So it's like instead of seeing mistakes as failures, we can start seeing them as opportunities to grow.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one source had this great suggestion for how to actually do that, how to develop that growth mindset. They said we need to reframe those negative self-talk patterns that we all fall into sometimes. Those voices in your head that say things like, I'm not good enough, or I'll never be able to do this.
Ugh, yeah, those thoughts can be so sneaky, can't they?
Yeah.
They really sabotage us. The sources suggest that we need to notice those negative thoughts and consciously try to replace them with something more positive and encouraging.
So it's like training your inner critic to become your inner cheerleader.
Exactly. Yeah. Love that.
I love that too. And one technique they suggest is to really focus on your strengths and celebrate your progress, no matter how small. Did you learn a new word today? Did you have a conversation where you felt a little more confident? Those are all things to celebrate.
Absolutely. And even just acknowledging those small wins can actually rewire our brains to focus on the positive, which just creates a more supportive, encouraging inner environment.
Right.
And that can really boost our motivation and help us stick with our language learning goals.
Yeah, it's like creating a positive feedback loop where every little victory fuels our desire to keep learning and growing. But let's be real, sometimes we need a little external support too, right? Did the sources mention any strategies for finding that support?
They did. They talk about the importance of surrounding yourself with a supportive community,
Oh.
whether it's a language exchange partner, an online forum, or even just a friend who's also learning English.
Hmm.
Having those people to practice with, to share struggles with, to celebrate your successes with, that can make a huge difference.
It's like having your own team of cheerleaders on the sidelines encouraging you to keep going. And speaking of encouragement, one of the sources had this great line: "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step."
I love that.
Right. It reminds us that even the most overwhelming tasks can be accomplished if we just break them down into smaller steps.
And sometimes the most important step is just believing in yourself,
Yeah.
believing that you can actually take that first step. So as we wrap up this deep dives, I want to leave you with this thought. You are capable of more than you think. Trust your ability to learn, embrace the journey, and never stop exploring the beauty and power of language.
What a beautiful way to end our conversation. I hope you're feeling inspired to take that next step on your English speaking journey. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and until next time, happy speaking.